You ever see a man point a loaded gun at someone and instantly regret it? Well, that's exactly what happened in front of my house last Saturday morning, and believe me, it still plays in my head like a movie. I was in my driveway, just unloading groceries from my truck, minding my own business, when everything took a turn for the insane. My daughter, Emily, had come over for the weekend. She'd been living in DC for years, so her visits were rare, but when she did come home, she always brought this calm, confident energy that seemed to change the entire atmosphere. She's not the kind of person who gets rattled. She walks with a purpose, carries herself like she's in control of the whole situation, and most people instinctively give her space. Most people. Unfortunately, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed security officer, Ron, wasn't most people. Ron was the kind of guy who wore sunglasses even in the shade, puffed out his chest when he walked, and seemed to think he was patrolling the streets of a war zone instead of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The HOA hired him a few months ago, but no one actually asked for a security guard, let alone one who acted like he was auditioning for an action movie. That morning, I heard heavy footsteps coming up the sidewalk behind me, the sound sharp and quick, like someone who wasn't just walking but marching. "Hey! You can't park here." Ron's voice came booming out before I even turned around. I glanced over my shoulder, confused, because I was standing in my own driveway. My truck was parked exactly where it should be, on my property. "Ron, this is my driveway," I said, thinking that would be the end of it. But he wasn't listening. He kept walking toward me, one hand resting on his hip in that dramatic way people do when they want you to think they have authority. Before I could say anything else, Emily came around the side of the truck carrying a box of groceries. The moment Ron saw her, his whole posture shifted. His voice dropped an octave, and his eyes narrowed. I thought maybe he was just being his usual obnoxious self, but then I saw it, his fingers curled around something at his side. I didn't process it immediately, but when his arm came up, my stomach dropped. It was a gun. He pulled out a black semi-automatic pistol and leveled it right at Emily's chest. For a split second, everything slowed down. My heart pounded in my ears. My hands went cold. It was one of those moments where your brain can't catch up to what's happening in front of you. I wanted to shout, to tell him to stop, to run at him and knock the weapon away, but my body felt like it was frozen. Emily stopped dead in her tracks, the box of groceries still in her hands. She looked at Ron, not with fear, but with this piercing focus that I'll never forget. Then, in one slow, deliberate movement, she set the box down on the driveway. She straightened her jacket, her eyes never leaving Ron's, and said in a voice so calm it almost didn't match the tension in the air, "Sir, you're pointing a loaded weapon at a federal agent. I'm going to give you 3 seconds to lower it before you regret every decision you've made this morning." I think Ron expected her to panic, to stammer, maybe even cry. Instead, she spoke with a steady authority that instantly changed the energy of the entire moment. My brain was still trying to process her words. Federal agent? My own daughter? Sure, I knew she worked in law enforcement in DC, but I didn't know all the details of her job. She kept things vague most of the time. But the way she said it, there was no mistaking she wasn't bluffing. Ron's smirk faltered. He blinked, like he was trying to decide if she was serious. He glanced at me, maybe expecting me to laugh it off, but I wasn't smiling. My face must have told him everything he needed to know, because his expression shifted from cocky to uncertain. Emily didn't move an inch. Her stance was solid, her voice low but commanding. I could almost feel the tension radiating between them, like two chess players waiting to see who would make the first mistake. In that moment, I realized something. Emily wasn't just defending herself. She was assessing him, reading every micro-expression, every twitch of his hand. And Ron? He didn't have a clue what kind of danger he was in, not from her gun, because she hadn't drawn one yet, but from the fact that he was about to learn the hard way that the wrong target can end your career in a single heartbeat. I stood there, my fists clenched, silently begging him to make the right choice. But deep down, I had a feeling Ron was the type who had to learn lessons the hardest way possible. Ron's smirk faded into something closer to confusion. It was almost comical, if the situation hadn't been deadly serious. His eyes darted from Emily's face to mine, as if he was trying to figure out if this was some elaborate prank. But Emily didn't move. She didn't blink. And when she reached into her jacket, slow, deliberate, no sudden motions, I could see Ron's grip on the gun falter ever so slightly. Her hand came back holding a black leather badge wallet. She flipped it open with a practiced flick of her thumb and held it steady in front of her chest. The gold and blue shone in the morning light. "Special Agent Emily Harper, FBI Tactical Operations," she said, her voice flat and official, the way you'd expect someone to sound when reading a Miranda warning. She kept her eyes locked on him. "You are pointing a loaded firearm at a federal officer, off-duty or not. That's a felony. Do you understand the gravity of that, Ron?" I'd never heard her speak that way before. Calm but with an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. It wasn't just confidence. It was authority. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind that makes the other person realize they're standing on thin ice. Ron's hand started to tremble, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have a snappy comeback ready. He stammered, I was just pointing a loaded weapon at a U.S. federal agent." Emily cut in, her tone dropping even lower, each word heavy and deliberate. "Do you know how many years in federal prison that earns you, even before I mention the state charges?" By now, a few neighbors had stepped outside. It started with Mrs. Green from across the street, phone in hand, already recording. Then came the Martins from 2 houses down, whispering to each other while they watched from the safety of their porch. Within seconds, half a dozen phones were pointed in Ron's direction, all catching the HOA's security officer with his weapon out. I took a step forward, anger finally breaking through my initial shock. "Ron, I warned you last month, stop harassing my family. Now you've crossed a line you can't uncross." But Emily didn't even acknowledge me. She kept her focus locked entirely on him. "Set the gun down," she instructed. "Slowly. Thumb off the safety. Place it on the ground and slide it forward." Ron hesitated. His eyes darted to the gathering crowd, then back to Emily, like he was calculating his chances of salvaging the situation. But whatever he saw in her expression convinced him otherwise. Slowly, stiffly, he crouched down, set the pistol on the concrete, and nudged it toward her. Emily stepped forward, picked up the weapon, and in one smooth motion dropped the magazine, ejected the chambered round, and placed both in her pocket. The entire move took her maybe 3 seconds. I couldn't help noticing the murmurs from the crowd as they realized she wasn't just claiming to be FBI, she moved like FBI. "You're done here," she told him, her tone leaving no room for argument. "But just so you understand, this isn't over. You're going to be held accountable for every second of what you just did." Ron looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting to find out if it was armed. His face was pale now, his bravado completely gone. He glanced around, clearly aware that his humiliation was being recorded from every angle. "Look, I didn't mean." "You don't pull a weapon unless you mean it," Emily said coldly. "And you definitely don't pull it on a law enforcement officer in her own father's driveway. Now, unless you want me to put you face down in the grass and cuff you myself, you're going to take 3 steps back and stay there until local police arrive." The crowd parted slightly as Ron shuffled backward, hands raised now, his gun nowhere in sight. His voice was barely above a whisper when he muttered, "This is all being blown out of proportion." Emily gave him a look so sharp I swear it could have pinned him to the wall. "No, Ron. This is proportionate. And you're going to learn exactly what proportionate consequences feel like." Somewhere down the street, I heard the faint wail of a siren getting closer. Ron heard it too. He glanced toward the sound, then toward the HOA president's house, as if silently begging for backup. But the president hadn't shown up yet, and judging by the look on Emily's face, even if she did, she wouldn't be able to stop what was coming. I realized then that Ron's big problem wasn't just that he had pulled a gun, it was that he had pulled a gun on the one person in this entire neighborhood who could, and would, dismantle him legally, step by step, without breaking a sweat. And as the sirens grew louder, I couldn't help thinking, this was about to get very, very bad for him. The police cruiser rounded the corner with lights flashing, the siren cutting off just as it pulled up in front of my driveway. Ron straightened up like a kid caught doing something wrong, desperately trying to compose himself before the officer stepped out. The officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense look, glanced around the scene in one sweep, the neighbors filming, Emily standing calm with a disarmed pistol in her hand, and Ron looking like someone had just drained all the color from his face. Before anyone else could speak, Emily held up her badge and said, "Special Agent Emily Harper, FBI Tactical Operations." This individual pointed a loaded firearm at me in my father's driveway without any legal cause or provocation. Her voice was steady, professional, and somehow even more commanding than when she'd been dealing with Ron. Ron jumped in immediately, his words tumbling out too fast. "Officer, I was just checking. I didn't know who she was. I thought she didn't belong here." The officer looked at him like he'd just confessed to robbing a bank and wondered why no one was applauding. "You thought she didn't belong here, so you drew your weapon?" His tone was sharp, incredulous. "I'm HOA security," Ron replied, puffing out his chest slightly, as if the title was supposed to mean something. The officer didn't even try to hide his disbelief. "Sir, you're telling me you think being hired by a homeowners association gives you the authority to brandish a firearm at someone on private property?" Ron's jaw clenched, but his voice faltered. "Well, I mean, No," the officer interrupted, his voice turning hard. "You don't have that authority. You just committed aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. And against a federal agent, which means the feds are going to be involved now. You understand what that means?" The air in the neighborhood seemed to thicken. The crowd had grown. At least a dozen people stood nearby, phones still pointed, whispering to each other. A couple of them were openly grinning, like they knew they were watching the kind of drama you couldn't make up. Just then, I saw Cheryl, the HOA president, marching toward us in her usual over-the-top fashion, high heels clicking on the pavement, big sunglasses perched on her face like she was walking a runway instead of heading into a crime scene. She didn't look concerned, she looked annoyed, like we'd all interrupted her plans for the day. "This is all a misunderstanding," she declared before she even reached us, her voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs. "Ron is just doing his job to protect our neighborhood." Emily turned her head slowly toward Cheryl, giving her a look so sharp I could almost feel it from where I stood. "If his job involves felony assault with a deadly weapon, then yes, he did it very well," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Cheryl tried to wave it off, her perfectly manicured hand fluttering in the air. "Come now, there's no need to get the police involved. I'm sure we can handle this internally without lawyers or the media." Emily cut her off mid-sentence. "You don't get to decide that. You're the head of the association that hired an unlicensed, untrained, and now criminally charged armed guard. This is no longer just a neighborhood matter. This is federal." The officer gave a single nod. "She's right, ma'am. And unless you want to get caught in the middle of this investigation, I suggest you stand back." For the first time, Cheryl's confidence cracked. She stepped back a couple of paces, her lips tightening. The neighbors weren't even trying to hide their amusement now, a few were outright smiling at the sight of the HOA president being shut down. Ron tried one last desperate attempt to save face. I thought she was trespassing. I was just trying to make sure." Emily's tone went cold. "You pointed a loaded gun at someone without confirming who they were, without calling local authorities, and without a single shred of legal justification. That's not security. That's recklessness, and it could have cost you your freedom, or someone's life. The officer stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Ron's shoulder. Sir, you're under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. You have the right to remain silent. Ron started to protest, but the officer's grip tightened. You might want to use that right, because everything you've said so far is digging you a deeper hole. As the cuffs clicked around Ron's wrists, I saw the shift in his expression, the mix of disbelief, humiliation, and the sudden realization that there was no quick way out of this. The crowd stayed silent, but the silence was thick with judgment. Emily handed the officer Ron's gun, unloaded and safe, along with the bullet she'd removed from the chamber. Evidence, she said simply. The officer nodded, slipping it into an evidence bag. We'll be in touch, Agent Harper. Ron was led toward the cruiser, his head down, and for the first time since this mess began, I let out the breath I'd been holding. The moment the car door closed behind him, the tension broke like a snapped rope. Emily turned to me, and I could see the faintest smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Well, she said, that's one way to spend a Saturday morning. I couldn't help but laugh, a little shaky, but genuine. The neighborhood was still buzzing, people already talking about how they'd post their videos online. I had a feeling this incident was about to get a lot bigger than our street, and Ron had no idea just how far this story was going to spread. By the time the police cruiser rolled away with Ron in the back seat, the entire neighborhood felt like it had been holding its breath and was finally letting it out. Conversations broke out in hushed but excited tones. People weren't just talking about what happened, they were already planning how to share it. I caught snippets from a few groups. I've got the whole thing from the moment he pulled the gun, one neighbor whispered. Another said, this is going to blow up online. And judging by the number of phones still in hand, I knew they weren't exaggerating. Emily, still calm and collected, took a moment to scan the scene. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. She pulled out her phone, snapped a few photos of the HOA security badge Ron had dropped on the driveway, and then took a wide shot of the crowd. Documentation, she told me quietly. The more evidence we have, the harder it is for them to twist the story. Cheryl, the HOA president, tried one more time to regain control. She stepped toward Emily, lowering her voice now that the officer was gone. Look, I understand you're upset, but let's be reasonable. Ron made a mistake. If you press charges, it's going to hurt the whole neighborhood's reputation. Maybe we can come to some sort of arrangement. Emily didn't even blink. This isn't about reputation, it's about accountability. Your HOA hired an armed guard without proper licensing, without background checks, and without any lawful authority to patrol this street. That's negligence, and now you're dealing with a criminal act on top of it. You should be calling your lawyer instead of me. The way she said it, steady, almost casual, made Cheryl's face tighten like she'd just bitten into a lemon. You don't have to drag the media into this, she tried again. There's no need for everyone to know. Emily cut her off like she had before. Everyone already knows. Half the block filmed it, and I guarantee some of them are uploading right now. If you want to do damage control, start with telling the truth. I couldn't stop the smirk tugging at my lips. It was the first time I'd ever seen Cheryl completely shut down, her usual fake smile nowhere in sight. She mumbled something about needing to make a phone call and walked quickly back toward her house, her heels clicking against the pavement. Over the next hour, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the buzz didn't die down. Neighbors stopped to thank Emily for handling the situation and to tell her how shocking it had been to see Ron actually pull his gun. One older man shook his head and said, I always knew that guy was trouble. Just didn't think it'd blow up like this. Later that afternoon, Emily sat at my kitchen table with her laptop open, filing her official report. It wasn't just a quick note. She was typing for a solid hour, pulling in details, timestamps, and even attaching screenshots of social media posts from neighbors who'd uploaded videos. Every so often she'd glance at her phone when a new clip popped up online, confirming the incident was already spreading beyond our community. By evening, local news outlets were calling me. I let them know Emily was the one to speak with, and she handled every question like she'd been doing it her whole life, calm, precise, and without giving the HOA any wiggle room. The headline on one article that night read, "Armed HOA guard arrested for pointing gun at FBI agent in her father's driveway." I could practically hear Ron groaning from his holding cell. The fallout for the HOA came fast. By Monday morning, residents were demanding a special meeting. People wanted answers. Why were we paying dues for security that turned into a danger? Who authorized hiring Ron without checking his credentials? And perhaps most importantly, why was Cheryl trying so hard to downplay it? Emily didn't attend the meeting, she didn't need to, but the mere mention of her name sent ripples through the room, according to my neighbor who filled me in later. Cheryl tried to blame Ron for acting independently, but nobody bought it. Residents started openly talking about removing the entire board. Meanwhile, Ron's legal trouble was stacking up like a bad poker hand. Not only was he facing state charges for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but the federal angle meant he'd be dealing with the FBI's legal team, too. Emily told me plainly, he's going to wish the only problem he had was losing his job. By the end of the week, videos of the incident had racked up hundreds of thousands of views online. Comment sections were brutal. People called Ron Rambo Reject, Neighborhood Rambo, and my personal favorite, HOA SWAT Team of One. Memes popped up showing a guy in a vest with captions like, "Sir, this is a driveway." As for Cheryl, her public image crumbled. Someone found old HOA meeting minutes showing she'd been the one to push for armed patrols, despite residents voting against it. That was the final straw for a lot of people. By Friday, petitions were circulating to dissolve the current board entirely. Through all of this, Emily stayed cool. She didn't gloat, didn't seek the spotlight, and never once raised her voice, which somehow made her even more intimidating. On Sunday night, before she headed back to DC, she handed me a folder. Everything's in there, my report, the incident number, the officer's contact info, and the evidence logs. If the HOA tries anything else, you've got the full paper trail. I looked at her, feeling this swell of pride I can't even fully describe. You didn't just handle this, I told her. You shut it down. She smiled faintly. Dad, they messed with the wrong family. That's all there is to it. And that's exactly what it was. The HOA had tried intimidation. They'd tried flexing fake authority. But in one reckless moment, they aimed their power at the wrong target, a woman who not only knew the law inside and out but had the skill and authority to enforce it. Now the neighborhood's safer, the HOA's power is crumbling, and Ron's probably still wondering how a simple Saturday morning turned into the worst decision of his life. If you ask me, it's a perfect example of what happens when bullies finally pick a fight they can't win.